Welcome back to the Kriya Yoga podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Kurczak, and I'm looking forward to today's discussion on the essence of yoga as the practice of Samadhi. In fact, in the last several years, I've been happy to see so many students experiencing this essence of Kriya Yoga practice. And these past few months, a growing inspiration has been coming to me to help support this process even more. And so in 2026, we're going to aim to dedicate our classes, podcasts, and retreats to helping those who are ready to better cultivate their own direct experience of Samadhi. So for 2026, Kriya Yoga Online and the Kriya Yoga podcast and the Kriya Yoga Online Patreon community, we're going to celebrate a year of Samadhi. And you can find available online and in-person offerings at kriyayogaonline.com, but I'm going to tell you about a few of them before we get started today. So currently on the Kriya Yoga Online Patreon community, patreon.com/kriyayoga, I've begun a new monthly class series focusing on the processes in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras which prepare you for the experience of Samadhi. And this will take about 6 to 8 months. So I'll be posting one class at the beginning of each month. And then at the end of January 2026, we have an online Samadhi Yoga book study group. And this will meet weekly for 6 weeks. In this study group, we're going to be focusing on the material in Vyas Houston's book, Yoga Sutras, the Practice. We're going to focus on the basic material. And I believe this material is extremely helpful. I've seen it help so many people learn to enter into the initial phases of Samadhi. In fact, the book itself is one of the texts that we use in the Advanced Kriya Yoga program, which follows the 2-year Kriya Yoga Apprenticeship. So that'll be the focus on this Samadhi Yoga book study group. And then in June of 2026, we have a retreat scheduled at the Himalayan Institute. And the focus is going to be to celebrate and explore Kriya Yoga and the Yoga Sutras. So all of these events and offerings are dedicated to sharing what I have felt so fortunate to have been given from my own teachers. And I want to see it accessible to anyone with the inspiration to engage this process of Samadhi Yoga, which is supported by our Kriya Yoga practice. That said, you can learn more about these offerings on our website, kriyayogaonline.com, but for now, let's go ahead and dig into this idea that true yoga is actually the practice of Samadhi. So Vyasa, one of the earliest commentators on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, he made a declaration that yoga is Samadhi. And this declaration captures the essence of Patanjali's teachings. It's also the essential principle of why we practice Kriya Yoga. Kriya Yoga is the path of action which removes the blockages and the obstacles to experiencing Samadhi directly. And so in actuality, when we practice meditation, when we live a yogic lifestyle that supports this capacity to experience Samadhi, we are fulfilling the practice, the ideals. We are fulfilling the promise of yoga, of Kriya Yoga. So what is Samadhi? We have to have a general sense of what Samadhi is in order to proceed forward. And this can be very hard because the idea of Samadhi, what we think Samadhi is, what we read about, what we are inspired towards, these are usually higher states of Samadhi which are essentially beyond the capacity of the mind. But there are more accessible forms of Samadhi which leads to greater clarity and access and entry into those higher states of Samadhi. But the core definition of Samadhi is that it is a state of absorbed and unwavering clarity, where the mind becomes relatively still. And we're stressing this idea of relative stillness because you might be able to experience a type of Samadhi, you might be able to experience a stillness in your mind, which compared to other people who just can't stop thinking. Their mind is always running. It is almost unreachable or unbelievable. But to you, since you've worked at it, since you've practiced at it, you can experience a state of stillness. And then once you master that state of stillness, as you proceed through the years of your practice, eventually it becomes even stiller, until what you had considered samadhi to be doesn't seem like samadhi at all. So we have to remember that yes, there are lower samadhis and there are higher samadhis, and then there is the ultimate samadhi, but we have to learn to take steps towards samadhi, and we do this by learning to focus our mind, to take our mind and absorb it into a meditation technique, a pranayama, a form of contemplation, or a mantra. And we also have to keep in mind that our yoga practice, the way we engage the limbs of yoga, we often think of them in parts, but really each part of our yoga contributes to this realization of samadhi. So samadhi is not just the final limb of yoga. It's the central phenomena that defines what yoga is. And when your mind rests in a unified field of awareness, with as little disturbance as possible, you are entering into samadhi. And again, Vyasa describes this as yoga's essential activity. It's the stilling of the fluctuations of the field of consciousness through sustained and steady attention. Remember, the beginning of the Yoga Sutras, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga is the cessation, the stilling of the fluctuations within your mind. Some define it as your mind field. Again, in previous podcasts, we had a discussion on what is chitta. Chitta is the field of your awareness. So as the field of your awareness becomes stiller, clearer, more serene, you are taking these steps towards a direct experience of samadhi. And the entire system of Kriya Yoga, the entire system of Patanjali's methodology, the ethical foundations, the ability to sit still, pranayama, withdrawing the senses, learning to concentrate, to experience meditation, all of this culminates in samadhi. We can look at this from the perspective of Kriya Yoga, as we've been taught through this lineage that Paramahansa Yogananda brought to the United States. We can also look at it through the framework of Patanjali. And these two things are not essentially different. In fact, they are the same. The Kriya Yoga that we know is falling under the umbrella of this system of Patanjali. In fact, I was told by my teacher, Roy Eugene Davis, that when Yogananda was preparing to leave for the United States, that his guru, Swami Sri Yukteswar, told him to teach Kriya with an emphasis on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And again, if you go back and you read Sri Yukteswar's book, Understanding the Holy Science, you will see these connections. But again, how do these tie together? Well, another quote from my teacher, Mr. Davis, someone asked him one time, do these Kriya Yoga techniques work? And he replied, the techniques work if you know how to work them. And that's essential. I see this all the time, meeting students, talking to people who have this idea that they don't have to understand the fundamental processes of practice. So if we look at our Kriya meditation practice, which focuses on what? Circulating life force through the spinal pathway, or bringing awareness to the psychophysiological energy centers within the body, the chakras. Well, in order for you to benefit from that process, you have to develop the capacity to feel into the experience of the body and to hold your attention there. And so what you have to do is you have to learn to let go of distractions. You have to learn to practice detachment from everything else that's going on in your life so that you can sit still turn your awareness within and feel into those areas of the body. But you have to be vigilant about it. You have to keep yourself present and not let yourself drift off into daydreams. You have to feel deeply into what you are doing. So when you learn the Kriya Pranayama practices and you are engaged in circulating, feeling, imagining this life force ascending through the spinal pathway and flowing back down, you have to choose for the duration of your practice to let go of everything else and to focus only on that experience. Now, in the beginning, that's difficult because there are all kinds of distractions and your mind wants to go here and it wants to go there. But every single day that you sit down and try, and you give yourself permission to focus fully on what you've been instructed to do, you are going to notice that as the weeks and months go by, it becomes very easy for you. And in time, we'll say a year, 2 years, you will notice that as you focus on your meditation technique again, or your mantra, or simply sensing into the chakra regions, that your mind is stiller, quieter. There are less fluctuations and distractions. And so you are seeing that you are moving closer to the experience of Samadhi. And with that continued practice, there will come times where 30 seconds will go by, a minute will go by, 10 minutes will go by, a half hour will go by, and you will realize that you haven't really thought about anything else. You've simply been present with the breath, with the mantra, with the meditation technique. And so in that way, the techniques have worked because you have worked the techniques. In Patanjali's system, which again is very much a part of what we know to be the Kriya Yoga system, in fact, it is the fundamental principles of the whole thing, you are given guidance on how to focus inward, how to direct your attention inward, how to overcome the obstacles to distractions. And in doing so, you find that your mind, your chitta, your mind field becomes calmer. I mentioned the class that we're currently doing with the Kriya Yoga Online Patreon community. Well, that's focusing essentially on Sutras 33 through 39 in Chapter 1 of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And as it relates to our Kriya practice specifically, in Sutra 34, there is this recommendation to focus on experiencing the flow of the breath. And by experiencing the flow of the breath, your chitta, your mind field becomes calm and still. Our Kriya Pranayama ties into this. It activates this process. And then the next sutra, Sutra 35, there is this description of having our mind field, our consciousness, clarified and made serene by focusing on subtle sensory objects. And those subtle sensory objects, there are many of them, but from our Kriya Yoga perspective, as we feel into the spinal pathway, into the chakra system, it is the focusing on the sensation of those energies within and along the spine, exploring them, resting our attention on them. So we can see that in Patanjali's system, there are these recommendations of how to prepare yourself for Samadhi, and they are related directly to what we do in our Kriya Yoga practice, specifically the Kriya techniques. In fact, even the next sutra, Sutra 36, where it talks about contemplation on that which is sorrowless and luminous, Vishoka va Jyotishmati, this focus on what is sorrowless and luminous. Well, those of you who have learned the essential Kriya Yoga techniques, Jyoti Mudra focuses on this. It helps to cultivate the experience of inner light, this lightness, this sense of sorrowlessness and freedom. So every day that you practice and you give your full attention to these experiences, you are moving a little closer to this quality of Samadhi. You are preparing yourself for Samadhi. And in fact, you might even be experiencing very helpful forms of samadhi in the process. When you engage a pranayama technique and you are focused solely on the breath, the flow of the breath, the steadiness of the breath, and only maybe one or two thoughts come in and distract you while you're going through the process, but during that time that you are solely engaged in the breath, you are experiencing a form of samadhi with that. And that is imprinting itself on your citta. It's leaving like a residue, or it's reforming your citta into the habit of being one-pointed, of being able to focus deeply on the breath. Or as you go through your process of meditation, maybe you do feel a deep and abiding clarity, lightness, sorrowlessness within the heart, or maybe you even see a radiant light within the mind's eye. Those experiences can only happen if the waves of your mind, the waves of citta, have become stiller, clearer. So by focusing on that, tuning into that, practicing towards that, and then experiencing it, feeling it, you are experiencing a form of samadhi, which is preparing you for subtler and subtler stages of the process. Now, as I mentioned, there can be breaks in this experience. Maybe you're practicing and then you get a little distracted, but you learn to bring your attention back to it. And so as the weeks and months and years go by, there are less and less breaks in the experience, and then this culmination, this sustaining of samadhi on a particular experience becomes more natural to you and more accessible to you. And that's going to empower you to go more fully into the process. So it is likely that you have already had glimpses, experiences of samadhi. And I'm just encouraging you to pay attention to those things, to notice them, and to recognize that over the years, how it has become easier and easier for you to focus on the experience. Now, if you are struggling, if you have not found that is the case, that it has not become easier and easier, well, that means you need to go back to some basics. There is a popular yet inaccurate belief that if you just get the perfect technique or meet the perfect teacher or guru, that you just engage that technique or you are around that person and it's all going to work out. That's faulty. It doesn't work that way. You have to be prepared for the process. So if you've been practicing meditation, any kind of meditation, but this is the Kriya Yoga podcast, so we're going to be talking about Kriya. If you've been practicing for a while and you say, well, I have not experienced any kind of samadhi, or I just fall asleep, or it doesn't work for me, well, that indicates that you need to go back to some basics. And those basics are the cultivation of the yamas and the niyamas, learning to practice harmlessness, truthfulness, contentment. It also means that you might need to focus on some of these preparatory practices that Patanjali describes. For example, in that series of sutras, chapter 1, 33 through 39, those go through a progression. So if you can't just sit down and experience Vishoka, this sorrowless and luminous experience, or you can't just sit down and feel deeply into the body, if you can't do that, then you have to go back to the initial part of that process, and that starts with Chitta Prasadanam, which is learning to meditate on experiencing joy towards people who are happy, and learning to experience compassion towards those who are in difficult situations. Again, this is part of the class that we're going through on the Patreon site at the moment, Kriya Yoga Online Patreon site. But it's important to remember that this system is a beautiful system. It works so well, but you can't jump around. You have to follow the order of the system. So if you're hearing what I'm saying and you're saying, well, I can't quite get there just yet, it doesn't mean the system doesn't work. It means you need to back up a little bit. You need to focus on some basics. You need to focus on some foundational material first. And then you're going to notice that this works much better. I mean, when we think about what does Samadhi do? Well, Samadhi results in kaivalya, liberation of consciousness. And it gives a person this capacity to know what is permanent, what is true, what is unchanging. And it gives the person the capacity to rise above and not be disturbed by the fluctuations within the world, the changes that come our way. And in that way, it gives us greater peace of mind. However, you can't appreciate that which is changeless and formless. You can't appreciate that if you are still struggling with the emotional relationship drama that won't leave your mind. Or it's very hard to grasp and process these subtler realizations if you are struggling to arrange your life so that you can actually get enough sleep so that you have the energy and the clarity to meditate. Even when it comes to the idea of the yamas and niyamas, practicing harmlessness, truthfulness, contentment, svadhyaya, tapas, ishvara pranidhana, and so on. Some have said that you just have to practice the techniques and it'll all work out. Well, if you are already living a very refined and supportive and healthy life, then yes, that's probably true. But the reason that most people avoid the yamas and the niyamas is because it requires a certain level of inner maturity to feel why it is important to not harm other people. It requires a certain level of psychological stability and well-being to feel safe enough to speak your truth, to be established in truth, and to not use truth as a weapon. And it is by cultivating those parts of us, the safety, the clarity, the maturity, that we are filled with a greater sense of light and stability, so that when we sit down to meditate, it actually works. And so we see that this practice of Samadhi doesn't simply mean that you found this super awesome technical technique which just puts all of your consciousness into place, and then there you are in a state of clarity, a state of divine realization. It's important to remember that your whole life are the puzzle pieces that have to be arranged so that this wholeness, this truth of your spirit can be recognized. And if you are ignoring any parts of your life or any parts of the yoga process, from the yamas to the niyamas, to being able to sit still, to focusing on pranayama and breath awareness and learning to internalize your awareness, if you're ignoring any of those, there's an indication that there's a part of your life, a part of the puzzle that you are also ignoring. And that's going to prevent you from being able to really experience what yoga has to offer. So ultimately, arrange your life so that it can be as organized as possible. Arrange your life so that when you sit down to meditate, even if all you are doing is staring at a candle flame and giving your full attention to the candle flame, that you have the ability to sink your attention completely into that experience. By learning to do that, you are bringing yourself closer and closer to this capacity for inner absorption, which is Samadhi. And then you will begin to have the experiential dimension of yoga. So going back to what Vyasa was saying when he said yoga is Samadhi, he was stating a few things, that Samadhi is the defining practice of yoga. It's the culmination of all yogic methods. It reveals the nature of consciousness and it leads to liberation. And essentially, it is the living experiential heart of the yogic journey. Yoga only becomes yoga when it becomes this grasping or experiencing of Samadhi, the stilling of the waves within the field of your mind and the field of your consciousness. Now, there is a very accessible way to Samadhi. And we've been talking about it throughout this podcast, throughout all of the Kriya Yoga classes that are available to you. But you have to be sincerely interested in cultivating it. Now, I've read this quote before. I'm sure you've heard it. But this is a quote from Vilas Houston. And this quote just sticks with me. He wrote that there seems to be a persistent belief among us that the various states of Samadhi, let alone nirvana or kaivalya, described in ancient classical texts on yoga are unapproachable. For thousands of years before the more recent age of worldwide commerce and industry and technology, this was not the case. In the vast body of sacred Sanskrit texts, as well as vernacular literature, we see a continuous outpouring of unbounded enthusiasm and encouragement, a seemingly endless reservoir of inspiration from countless enlightened sages, generation after generation. The expectation of spiritual illumination was high because the ancients had found not just a specific way, but multiple ways to the transcendence of time and space. And I also want to assure you that this is a possibility for you. And again, many of you have probably already known this for yourselves. I've had the benefit of learning from two very profound teachers. And I've had the benefit of experiencing the grace of these practices and the depth of meditation available when you engage yoga specifically for the purpose of Samadhi. I've also had the benefit of observing students practice yoga in such a way that they can repeatably, sustainably, and consistently return to, if not very deep states of Samadhi, the initial states of Samadhi. And while there are many things in life that we can do that can bring us joy, nothing is as permanent or as nourishing as an experience of spiritual realization. And this is not a peak experience that simply blows your mind away. This is an experience of knowledge, of knowing what is true, of living within that truth. And it develops gradually, and it transforms your life from being defined by all of these changes and fluctuations that you see, the rise and fall of pleasure and pain, of praise and blame, of heat and cold. It takes you from that, and it allows you to feel and abide in the ground of being, the still point that knows and observes all of these changes in life. One of the students within the Kriya Yoga Apprenticeship program who recently has become a Kriya Yoga meditation facilitator, Ryan Kurczak, he was doing a study group on our 12-week Introduction to Kriya Yoga course. And I happened to listen to some of the recordings from that course. And he said something that made me laugh out loud. He said, if you're looking for a peak experience, there's a shaman in the jungle somewhere with a bowl of ayahuasca for you. But this is not that path. And I speak to this because there is an idea that Samadhi is a peak experience. And in a way, it is a long-term peak experience, but it is not something that is entertaining, that flashes into your mind and leaves this imprint where you run around saying, I've had a spiritual awakening. It is a state of being, a state of the field of your consciousness that you cultivate over time. You grow into it naturally. And in that growing into the experience, when you read the Yoga Sutras, when you read the works of your favorite spiritual teacher, enlightened spiritual teacher that is, when you contemplate the meaning of your life and so on, there is an inner stillness, an intuitive assurance, a sense of knowing what you are at the core of your being. And it allows you to live effectively in this world. And it also allows you to live without fear and to live with a sense of deeper connection to the wholeness of life and even enthusiasm and inspiration about what it means to be alive as a spiritual being in this world. And this becomes accessible by the consistent practice of your meditation, knowing that when you sit down to meditate, that half hour, hour and a half, however long you have, you make sure that during that time you are cultivating one-pointedness. And in that cultivation of one-pointedness, during that time, the fluctuations and changes within your field of awareness become much less. And then that spills over into the rest of your life. But it all starts with this meditation practice. So what I'd like to encourage you to do is, from this point forward, even if you've been a long time meditator, look at your path, your practice with new eyes. Look at it with a beginner's mind. And when you sit down to meditate, decide what are the techniques you're going to do. Mantra, pranayama, whatever you like to do. But decide that as you engage those techniques, that you are engaged in it for the purpose of samadhi. Which means what? That you want to experience a cognitive absorption with what you are focusing on. So if you're focusing on a mantra, decide that each moment you are pristinely present with that mantra. You're going to be saying the same sounds and syllables over and over again, but make it such that as you practice, each moment is as real and important as the last. And if you're engaging a breath awareness practice, or your pranayama practice, or your Kriya pranayama practice, don't just go through the motions to hope you're getting them done. Focus on the depth of feeling in your body from moment to moment. Be as present with the process as you can. And keep in mind, you will get distracted. Thoughts will come in. But just acknowledge it and say, all right, let's come back to now. What is the breath doing now? What is this focus of breath awareness? What is happening in my body, in my mind, as I feel this inward flow of breath and I feel this outward flow of breath? Focus on the breath moment to moment, as if each breath, as if each stage of the process is actually the most important thing in your life right now. And this will develop a momentum. You'll get good at it. You'll start to recognize that, wow, I can hold my attention on these meditation techniques very well. And in those moments where that's all you are aware of is the specific technique or the specific idea of contemplation, you are experiencing a form of samadhi. And that's where you should start. Start right there. As I mentioned, even if you are, as you might call yourself, an advanced meditator who's been meditating for many, many years, I think you'll find that if you come back to this basic premise, that your meditation practice will be renewed, that the enthusiasm, the inspiration to explore the process in a richer way will reveal itself to you. And then if you like, we can explore these things together with the classes that we've already mentioned. You can learn to understand more of the mechanics of it. But again, for now, remember that yoga is samadhi. Everything that you do that is part of your yoga practice, it is all leading to this culmination, this experience of recognizing that you have the capacity and you can regularly step into a state of samadhi. Even if it's a lower samadhi, the cultivation of those lower samadhis in time eventually lead to the capacity to experiencing what we would call a higher samadhi. And then that would also lead to the capacity eventually to experience the final samadhi, asampragyata samadhi. but that's a little bit beyond what we can discuss in the time that we have today. So I'd like to close to encourage you to remember the words of a very great Swami, Swami Veda Bharati. He once said, to be ambitious. He said, the problem is that you have no ambition, so be spiritually ambitious. And he wasn't encouraging you to be egotistical in your ambition, very much like the quote from Vilas Houston earlier, where he said, in the vast body of Sanskrit texts as well as vernacular literature, we see a continuous outpouring of unbounded enthusiasm and encouragement, a seemingly endless reservoir of inspiration from countless enlightened sages generation after generation. The expectation of spiritual illumination was high because the ancients had found not just a specific way, but multiple pathways to the transcendence of time and space. That is accessible to you. So be ambitious. See and feel that it is a possibility, and know that every step you've taken up to this point, every moment of study, every instance of engaging in a meditation practice, every time that you have worked to engage the yamas and niyamas and to become a more psychologically healthy human being, you have been putting together the pieces towards this experience of samadhi. So you've already been doing a lot. Now, if you need some help, you need some support, that is the whole point of this upcoming year, 2026, the year of Samadhi that we'll be exploring through Kriya Yoga Online. So I welcome you to join us. If you're not a member of any of the Kriya Yoga Online communities, then feel free to reach out and ask how to become involved in some of these classes or retreats, and we'll be happy to help you. Remember, yoga is Samadhi. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Kriya Yoga Podcast. To learn more about Kriya Yoga meditation, you can visit us at kriyayogaonline.com, where you can find information about current book releases, online classes, and in-person retreats throughout the year. If you're interested in supporting this podcast, visit us at the Kriya Yoga Online Patreon community at patreon.com/Kriya Yoga.